Imagine spotting a ship alone in the middle of the Atlantic. Its sails are up, its hull is still intact. Nothing appears to be sinking, but as you get closer, something feels terribly wrong. There is nobody on deck, nobody answers your calls, and when you finally step aboard, you discover something that would haunt sailors for generations. The entire crew is gone. The ship was called the Mary Celeste. On December 4th, 1872, another vessel called the Dei Gratia spotted her drifting roughly 400 miles east of the Azores. From a distance, she looked like an ordinary merchant ship, but the closer the Dei Gratia came, the stranger everything became. The Mary Celeste appeared to be sailing without anyone aboard. Captain David Morehouse ordered his men to investigate. A small group crossed the water toward the mysterious vessel. They expected to find injured sailors. Perhaps the crew had been overwhelmed by a storm. Perhaps the ship had suffered some terrible accident. But when the men climbed aboard, they found something much harder to explain. The ship was almost completely empty. There was no captain, no crew, no woman, no child. Not a single person remained aboard. Yet the Mary Celeste had not been destroyed. She was not resting on the ocean floor. She was still floating, still carrying her cargo, and still capable of sailing. The missing people were Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, and 7 other crew members. 10 people in total. 10 people who had boarded the ship in New York. 10 people who were never seen again. But the Mary Celeste had something that made the mystery even stranger. It still contained signs of ordinary life. Only weeks earlier, Benjamin Briggs had been preparing for what should have been a routine voyage. The Mary Celeste had departed New York on November 7, 1872. Her destination was Genoa, Italy. The ship carried a large cargo of industrial alcohol. Nothing about the voyage seemed destined to become one of history's most famous maritime mysteries. Briggs was an experienced sea captain. He knew the dangers of the Atlantic, and this time his family was traveling with him. His wife Sarah had come aboard. So had their young daughter Sophia. For the Briggs family, this was supposed to be a journey across the ocean. It would become their final voyage. The Mary Celeste sailed eastward. Day after day, the ship disappeared farther from America. The crew worked. The family lived aboard. The Atlantic stretched endlessly around them. For a while, everything appeared normal. But the ocean was beginning to change. The weather became rough. Strong winds and heavy seas made the voyage more difficult. The Mary Celeste continued forward, but conditions in the Atlantic were becoming increasingly dangerous. On a wooden sailing ship in 1872, there was nowhere to hide from the ocean. Every storm could become a threat. Every strange sound could mean trouble. Then came November 25th. That day, the final known entry was made in the Mary Celeste's logbook. After that point, the record becomes silent. No later entry has survived to explain what happened. No final message, no description of an emergency, no account of the moment the crew disappeared. Just silence. 9 days later, another ship came into view. It was the Dei Gratia. Captain David Morehouse and his crew were crossing the Atlantic when they noticed the Mary Celeste. Something about her movement seemed wrong. Her sails were set, but the ship did not appear to have anyone properly controlling her. The Dei Gratia moved closer. The sailors watched the Mary Celeste carefully. They tried to signal her. Nothing. They tried again. Still nothing. The Mary Celeste continued drifting through the Atlantic as if no one were listening. That was when the crew realized this was not a normal encounter. The boarding party climbed onto the Mary Celeste. They searched the deck. Nothing. They checked the ship's interior. Still nothing. The silence was overwhelming. A ship designed to carry human beings had suddenly become a floating empty space. But the men were about to discover that the mystery went much deeper. The captain's belongings were still there. Personal possessions had not simply vanished. The ship had not been stripped clean. There was no obvious sign that the crew had packed everything and deliberately left forever. It looked as though the people aboard had simply walked away from their lives, and that raised the most important question. Why? The cargo was still aboard. The Mary Celeste had been carrying around 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol. Most of it remained. There was no obvious evidence that pirates had boarded the vessel and stolen the valuable cargo. If criminals had taken the crew, they had left behind one of the most obvious reasons to attack the ship. Then the boarding party discovered something else. Food was still aboard. Water was still aboard. The ship was not a floating skeleton. There were supplies. There was cargo. There was a functioning vessel. And yet the people who needed those supplies had disappeared. The lifeboat was missing. That detail changed everything. The crew had apparently left the Mary Celeste somehow. But why would experienced sailors abandon a ship that was still afloat? Had they believed the ship was about to sink? Had something frightened them? Or had something happened that we still don't understand? One of the ship's pumps had been partially disassembled. There was also water inside the vessel. Not enough to prove that the Mary Celeste was about to sink, but enough to raise questions. Perhaps the crew had become concerned about the ship's condition. Perhaps the captain believed the situation was more dangerous than it appeared. Then, there was the cargo. Alcohol, a highly flammable substance. Some barrels were later found to have leaked. Could fumes have filled parts of the ship? Could the crew have feared an explosion? Could Captain Briggs have believed that remaining aboard was too dangerous? These are possibilities. But they are not proven facts. Imagine being Captain Briggs. The ship is taking on water. The weather is rough. There is alcohol below deck. You don't know exactly how serious the situation is. Your wife and your 2-year-old daughter are with you. Would you risk staying aboard? Or would you order everyone into the lifeboat? The decision may have been made in minutes. One theory suggests that Briggs may have ordered the crew to leave the Mary Celeste temporarily. The idea may have been simple. Get away from the ship. Wait until the danger passes, then return. But the Atlantic is not forgiving. A small lifeboat can disappear from a ship's sight surprisingly quickly. If the lifeboat was connected to the Mary Celeste by a line, the crew may have believed they could remain close to the ship. But one sudden change in weather could alter everything. A rope could snap. A wave could separate the vessels. The Mary Celeste could drift one way, the lifeboat another, and suddenly, 10 people could find themselves alone in the Atlantic. If that happened, the Mary Celeste would have become a ghost ship by accident. Not because of a curse, not because of a monster, but because the ship had simply drifted away from the people who had been trying to survive. It is only a theory, but it is one of the explanations that fits several known facts. Still, many questions remain. Why did no one return? Why was the lifeboat never found? Why did no member of the crew ever reach another ship? Why did the ocean provide no clear evidence? The Atlantic is enormous. A small boat can disappear into it forever. But the mystery attracted darker theories. Some suspected piracy. Others imagined mutiny. Some believed there had been a violent struggle aboard the ship. Over the years, the story became more dramatic. The Mary Celeste stopped being merely an abandoned vessel. It became a legend. But when investigators examined the ship, there was no definitive evidence of a mass murder. There was no confirmed massacre, no proven pirate attack, no reliable evidence that the crew had been deliberately killed. The absence of evidence did not solve the mystery. It only made it harder. There was another theory. Perhaps the crew had become convinced that the Mary Celeste was about to explode. The alcohol cargo could have produced dangerous fumes. A sudden release of vapor might have terrified the people aboard. Even without an actual explosion, fear alone could have been enough to trigger a desperate decision. Now imagine the final moments. The captain gives an order. The crew rushes to prepare the lifeboat. Sarah gathers Sophia. Men climb down from the Mary Celeste. The ship remains behind them. They believe they will return. At least, that may have been what they believed. The lifeboat moves away from the Mary Celeste. The ship is still visible. The crew can still see its sails. Perhaps they expect to return within minutes. But the ocean is changing. The wind increases. The distance grows. And then something happens that no one survives to describe. The Mary Celeste disappears from their reach. Maybe the line broke. Maybe the weather pushed them apart. Maybe something else happened entirely. Whatever the reason, the people in the lifeboat were suddenly separated from the ship. And somewhere out there, the Atlantic was waiting. Meanwhile, the Mary Celeste continued sailing, without a captain, without a crew, without a single person aboard. The ship did what ships do. The wind filled its sails, the ocean pushed against its hull, and the vessel continued across the Atlantic as if nothing had happened. 9 days after the last known log entry, the day Gracia found her. Imagine what that must have looked like. A merchant ship drifting in the open sea, sails still raised, cargo still inside. No visible disaster, no people, no explanation, just an empty ship. The men searched again. They looked for evidence. They examined the condition of the vessel. They searched for signs that might explain why the crew had left. But the ship refused to tell them what happened. Every clue seemed to raise another question. And then, the most haunting thought appeared. What if the crew had been alive when they left? What if they had expected to return? What if they had watched the Mary Celeste drift away? If so, the ship wasn't the final mystery. The lifeboat was. Where did it go? No one knows for certain. No confirmed remains of the missing crew were ever recovered. There was no final message, no surviving witness, no definitive account of the last hours of Benjamin Briggs and his family. The ocean simply closed over the story. News of the abandoned ship spread quickly. The Mary Celeste became international news. But as the story traveled, facts and rumors began to mix. The mystery became larger than the evidence. And soon, the Mary Celeste was being described as something far more frightening than an abandoned merchant ship. It became a ghost ship. In 1884, writer Arthur Conan Doyle published a fictional story inspired by the Mary Celeste. His story introduced dramatic details that were not part of the real case. But fiction has a strange way of becoming confused with history. As decades passed, the legend grew. The real Mary Celeste became harder to separate from the stories people told about her. But strip away the legends, forget the monsters, forget the curses, forget the sensational stories. What remains is still extraordinary. A real ship, a real captain, a real family, 7 real crew members, and 10 real people who vanished. The ship was found. The cargo was there. Supplies were there. The vessel was still afloat. The lifeboat was gone, and the people were missing. Those are the facts. Everything else must be treated as a theory. Maybe the crew abandoned the ship because they genuinely believed it was sinking. Maybe the alcohol cargo frightened them. Maybe the pump problems made the situation appear worse than it was. Maybe a sudden change in weather separated them from the ship. Or maybe the true explanation is something we have never considered. That uncertainty is what makes Mary Celeste so powerful. There is no final photograph, no recovered lifeboat with a clear explanation, no surviving sailor saying, "This is what happened." There is only an empty ship and a trail of unanswered questions. For the Briggs family, the mystery was not a story. It was their lives. Benjamin Briggs disappeared. Sarah Briggs disappeared. Their 2-year-old daughter disappeared. 7 other sailors disappeared with them. Families waited, people searched, but the Atlantic gave nothing back. The Mary Celeste, however, survived. She was brought to Gibraltar. Authorities investigated the circumstances surrounding the abandoned ship. Suspicion fell on the crew at various points. But no definitive criminal explanation was established. The case remained unresolved. And that is an important distinction. We know the Mary Celeste was abandoned. We know 10 people disappeared, but we do not know exactly why they left. Any explanation beyond that is interpretation. More than a century later, the central mystery remains. Perhaps the simplest explanation is also the most tragic. A captain saw danger. He made a decision. He believed leaving the ship was safer. And then something went horribly wrong. One decision, one lifeboat, one ocean, 10 lives, gone. Think about the Mary Celeste after the crew disappeared. Their belongings were still there. Their supplies were still there. Their unfinished journey was still there. The ship had become a time capsule, a snapshot of the moment when ordinary life suddenly stopped. And somewhere beyond the horizon, there may once have been a tiny lifeboat. 10 people, 1 family, 7 sailors, surrounded by nothing but water. Perhaps they saw the Mary Celeste disappear. Perhaps they never saw another ship again. Perhaps the answer lies at the bottom of the Atlantic. The Mary Celeste continued to sail into history. Every generation found a new explanation. Every explanation seemed to solve one part of the puzzle while creating another. That is why the mystery survived. Not because there are no theories, but because there are too many. More than 150 years later, we can reconstruct parts of the story. We can examine the ship's journey. We can study the weather. We can analyze the cargo. We can consider what a 19th century captain might have feared. But we cannot reconstruct the one moment that matters most. The moment 10 people disappeared. Maybe one day new evidence will finally reveal what happened aboard the Mary Celeste. Until then, the ship remains one of history's most haunting maritime mysteries. A ship was found, its cargo remained, its supplies remained, its sails remained, but its people were gone. And perhaps that is what makes the Mary Celeste so terrifying, because the greatest mystery isn't how the ship survived, it's why 10 people stepped off it and were never seen again.